All right. So hi, everyone, and thanks so much for coming to today's conversation with the history program. So today is the second part in our 2-week series around the theme of back to school. I know that the phrase back to school takes me back and conjures a lot of memories from lots of first days of school in my own life, from kindergarten through grad school. And I know that back to school is very different this year than when many of us were students in a more formal setting, with many educators and students either partially or entirely learning remotely. But for centuries, Boston and Massachusetts have been centers of early public education and notable education reformers. And throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, King's Chapel was a spiritual home to a number of influential educators, including advocates for women's education and pioneers in the predecessors to distance learning. And so today I'll be diving into the lives and careers of several of these educators and focusing in on 3 particular individuals: George Beryl Emerson, Anna Elliott Tickner, and Ella Lyman Cabot. But before I get kind of deeper, though, I think it's important to at least touch upon the broader history of education in Massachusetts, including mentioning a little bit about a couple notable educators with connections to the church before diving into the 3 folks I mentioned before. So just going all the way back to the 1630s, Boston is home to Boston Latin School, which is the first public school in the English colonies, and it was located on the site that is now the site of King's Chapel. So the 2 locations were neighbors for a while. And in the 1640s, Massachusetts introduced a series of laws relating to providing public education. After the American Revolution, when John Adams is drafting the Massachusetts Constitution in the 1780s, he included provisions that guaranteed public education to all citizens. And in 1789, Massachusetts was the first state in the nation to pass comprehensive education law. To mention a few notable educators and reformers who I won't get quite as much into today, who do have connections to the church. One is Samuel Gridley Howe, who in 1829 was one of the founders of the Perkins School for the Blind. He worshiped at King's Chapel for a short period in the mid-19th century, and as I said, was one of the founders and early presidents of Perkins School for the Blind, which is the oldest school dedicated to students with blindness in the United States. Another educator with kind of loose ties to the church is Bronson Alcott, known kind of in his own right as a transcendentalist and educator, as well as the father of Louisa May Alcott. In 1834, he opened Temple School just down the street from where King's Chapel is located on Tremont Street in Boston. The school centered around his experimental approaches to education, which included ideas like child-led learning, incorporating art and nature study into the classroom, field trips, and banishing corporal punishment from his classrooms. He was also an early advocate for physical education and kind of the predecessors to what we consider recess today. And while many of his ideas in terms of education are pretty commonplace in the United States today, a lot of parents at the time didn't really understand his approach to education and were honestly hesitant to enroll their children. While Bronson Alcott was not a member of King's Chapel, he does have a personal connection to the church. Alcott was married to Abigail May at King's Chapel in the 1830s, who was the daughter of a prominent lay leader within the church. We also see in 1845, a member of King's Chapel, Charles Sumner, was involved in a major case in Boston, Sarah Roberts versus the City of Boston, which focused around school segregation. The case was co-argued by lawyers Robert Morris and Charles Sumner on behalf of Benjamin Roberts and his 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, who was forced to go to a segregated school far from her home, despite passing 5 schools for white children on her walk to the school she was forced to attend. Morris and Sumner made a strong case for Sarah and students like her throughout the city, arguing that an 1845 statute in Boston protected her rights to attend a school in her community. Sumner powerfully closed his arguments, saying, quote, "The separation of the school so far from being for the benefit of both races is an injury to both. It tends to create a feeling of degradation in the Blacks and a prejudice and uncharitableness in the whites." Unfortunately, they lost the case, but in 1855, Massachusetts finally outlawed public school segregation. However, the precedent for the separate but equal argument that was made in Plessy versus Ferguson later in the century was set by the judge in Roberts versus the city of Boston. So this is just some of the broader context of education reforms and developments taking place in Massachusetts that provide some of the backdrop for the work done by members of King's Chapel. So the first person we'll talk about in more depth is this man you see on your screen now, George Beryl Emerson. George Beryl Emerson was born in Maine in 1791 and graduated from Harvard in 1817 before beginning a career in education. Two of his first jobs out of school were as headmasters or principals of schools for boys, but this is not the legacy that he would leave on education in Massachusetts. If you are wondering, yes, Emerson is indeed related to famed transcendentalist and writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. The two men were second cousins. But in 1823, when George Emerson was just 26 years old, he undertook a new endeavor, promoting women's education. Having worked in schools that only provided education for male students, Emerson was struck by the difference in the quality of education and schooling available to many girls versus boys, and decided to open his own school, which he called the Emerson School for Girls. What's really cool is that there are these three amazing images. So this is one of them that are in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which were taken at the Emerson School for Girls around 1850. So as we're talking about his school and work, we have kind of this really cool, unique glimpse into the school setting. So this is a photograph that shows a classroom at the Emerson School for Girls with students and their teacher, and you can see a little bit of what that classroom setup was like. Over the course of his career, as I said, Emerson became a strong advocate of women's education and an influential writer as well. He contributed to a book for educators called School and Schoolmaster, which in the mid-19th century became a staple for educators in schools throughout Massachusetts and New York. And he worked as the headmaster at the Emerson School for Girls for over 30 years until retiring from teaching in 1855. In looking at his views on women's education, it is important to note that Emerson's views would not necessarily be interpreted as progressive today, and it's important to consider that he's writing and working in the 1820s through 1850s. But in a lecture he delivered on the importance of women's education in 1831, for example, George Beryl Emerson made the following comments. Education is a preparation for the future. Women, the daughter and sister, is destined to become the companion, the friend and wife. These social relations belong to her equally with man, and her interest in them is greater. But she has a higher destiny. She is to be a mother, and to form the heart, the character, and the mind of her children. But independently, and if previously to these relations, let us consider woman as she is in herself, as a solitary and intelligent being. In the lecture, he continues to outline what he sees as the various stages in a woman's life and various duties that she fulfills throughout her lifetime, from daughter to wife to mother. But his conclusion ultimately is that through the various stages in her life, women's education cannot be sacrificed. Women, in his view, need and deserve to receive educations just as men did, primarily because of the important social relationships that women held in society during this era. His exploration of the best course of study for women, he advocated for studying natural history, including botany and zoology, which were his personal interests and areas of expertise, various sciences to the extent that it would help them care for their family if ill, languages, writing, public speaking, as well as Latin, which was not considered as appropriate for women to study at the time. And he also advocated that the women should be taught mathematics. During the 1840s, we also know that Emerson set out to survey the state of Massachusetts to learn about the state of school libraries, and letters relating to this endeavor are in the collections of the Boston Public Library. Outside of the Emerson School for Girls, Emerson was also an accomplished naturalist and botanist, and he was a founder and officer of the Boston Society for Natural History. And as president of the organization in the 1830s, he worked on a massive project of doing botanical and zoological studies in the state, and ultimately was one of the founders of the Arnold Arboretum, which is pictured on your screen here. As a member of King's Chapel, Emerson also held important leadership positions. He served on the church's vestry or governing board for over a decade, and also served several terms as both the junior and senior warden, which were the highest lay leadership roles within the church governance. He worshiped from pew number 91 in the church gallery from 1843 until his death in 1881. And his involvement at the church was described as followed after his death. It's a long quote, so I may not read all of it, but this is kind of the reflection from his spiritual community, which says in part, Mr. Emerson was, through all the active days of his city life, a constant attendant at King's Chapel. No more striking proof can be given of the respect in which Mr. Emerson was held by the church and congregation than the fact that he was thus requested on occasions of such importance to act as their representative. His work as a teacher was a perpetual self-consecration to the highest purpose of existence. For 30 years, with wonderful success, he devoted himself to that genuine education, which consists in the development of the intellectual, moral, and religious powers. And he thus trained more than one generation of the best women in the community to an intelligent interest in all that is good, whether in literature or life. So the next influential educator at King's Chapel that I'll discuss is a bit of a shift from Emerson, but her work is particularly relevant to education in contemporary times in relation to the way that students are learning in the time of COVID. Anna Elliott Tickner, whose family worshiped at King's Chapel in the 1870s and 1880s, was a pioneer in distance learning. We learn from the church's pew ownership records that Anna's mother, who was also named Anna Elliott Tickner, owned pew 11 beginning in 1872, and the pew transferred ownership to Anna Elliott Tickner, the daughter, when her mother passed away in 1885. Both the Elliott and Tickner families have multi-general connections with King's Chapel in the 19th century, and it's likely that she may have been raised in the church in addition to attending in later life. She had a privileged upbringing, and her father was also involved in education. He was a professor at Harvard and was a historian of Spanish literature. From an early age, we know that Anna Elliott Tickner had become interested in writing, and she was a published author before she entered the field of education more formally. Anna Elliott Tickner's contribution to the field of education comes from her founding of the Society to Encourage Studies at Home, which was America's first distance learning school. In 1873, Tickner founded the society with the aim to, quote, to induce among ladies the habit of devoting some part of every day to the study of a systematic and thorough kind. Essentially, the school was conducted through the mail, with a similar model to how a lot of online courses work today. In a memorial book published shortly after Tickner's death in the closure of the school, her intention was further described as follows. While colleges and academies for women were springing up all over the country, Miss Tickner bethought herself of those whose homes were far away from the centers of learning and instruction, and yet who craved educational advantages for themselves and their families. With this idea in her mind, she worked out an organization. While her school was loosely inspired by an organization called the English Society for the Encouragement of Home Study, Tickner expanded upon that idea and made the program more accessible. The English counterpart was limited to wealthy women, offered only standard lessons, was self-directed, and required students to travel to London for their final exams, which was an added financial burden on the students. Anna Tickner saw all of these factors as both limiting and exclusionary, and she worked to model her school to be more personalized and hands-on. Her school was aimed for women who lived in more remote areas, or perhaps were mothers or factory workers, and kind of gave them their only ability at the time to pursue their education on their own terms. This school was also open to students regardless of race, but the school was strictly for women's education during her career. Students of Tickner Society to encourage studies at home was designed to be affordable, provide individualized lessons, and provide educators to regularly correspond by mail with students. And as I said, it was basically entirely conducted through the post office. This is what they sent was not only kind of lesson plans and instruction, but she also sent books, engravings, photographs, maps, and other sorts of educational resources to the students to aid in their coursework. Course topics ranged from the German language to various sciences, English literature. So it was really taking a kind of broad approach to education in terms of the subject matter at that time. In some areas around the country as well, women would create local clubs to study together in the absence of a formal classroom setting and create kind of these small communities, intellectual communities centered around learning together. While the school ceased to continue long after Tickner's death in 1896, the school served over 7,000 students with over 200 teachers during its 24 years in existence. Tickner also organized an impressive lending library. This is a photograph of the library in her home on Park Street, which is also in pretty close proximity to King's Chapel. But she established this lending library to assist her students, and her work organizing this contributed to her serving as a commissioner on the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners in the 1890s. And this made her one of the first women appointed to a state library agency in the country. Today, they, being the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners, actually has an award named after Tickner that is given to librarians who work to increase access to resources within their communities. In an age of online learning in remote classrooms around the world today, we can perhaps acknowledge Anna Elliott Tickner for her pioneering work in this type of education. The last educator and reformer of King's Chapel that I'll discuss today is Ella Lyman Cabot, who is one of only 2 women whose likenesses are depicted on the memorials within King's Chapel. And this is a photograph of her memorial plaque that hangs in the chapel today. Cabot was born into privileged and wealthy Lowell and Lyman families in 1866 and dedicated most of her adulthood to education and working as a career woman. If the name Lyman sounds familiar to some of you, it is the same family that owned the Lyman estate in Waltham, which is pictured on the left, which is now a historic New England property. We know that Ella spent time at this family estate, and there are photographs like the one on the right of her on the grounds, though the family lived also on 39 Beacon Street in Boston, which is literally just a 5-minute walk from King's Chapel, so very close by. After studying at Radcliffe College, she took graduate courses at Harvard, but was not able to receive a degree for her work due to her gender. There are even records to suggest that some of her male colleagues received accolades for her work in philosophy and ethics, rather than her getting the credit she deserved. As an educator, Ella taught ethics, psychology, and philosophy courses at various private schools and also at Pine Manor. And she was also the director of King's Chapel Sunday School for 12 years, having restructured the program to better serve its students. So during this time in the 1920s, King's Chapel purchased its first parish house, which was located on Marlborough Street in Boston, which allowed Cabot to really expand and continue to grow the church school. Her work with religious education caught the eye of a woman named the Reverend Florence Buck, who was the director of religious education for the American Unitarian Association. With Cabot's work within the church school and the involvement of Florence Buck, King's Chapel for some period in the 1920s was actually used as a model for religious education within the wider Unitarian Church. Some of the reforms that she enacted within the church school and her secular education, including limiting enrollments to allow for better student to teacher ratios. For instance, the church school was capped at 60 students at any given time so that they could ensure they had enough educators to serve the needs of the students. They also incorporated more kind of continuing learning opportunities for adults rather than just serving the needs of younger students. And in both her religious and secular work, Ella Lyman Cabot advocated for children's education and for using age-specific teaching techniques. She also published several books on ethics and wrote extensively about philosophy, including texts especially about teaching ethics to children. But as I mentioned a bit earlier, she didn't receive formal recognition for a lot of her contributions to the field as a woman in a male-dominated society in the late 19th and early 20th century. She did serve on a number of boards, including the board of Radcliffe College and the Massachusetts Board of Education. And in 1939, her husband, Robert Clark Cabot, established a trust in her honor to aid individuals in effecting positive change in the world. And the Ella Lyman Cabot Trust actually still exists today. So as you can see, there are many, many various contributions to the field of education and education reform made by former members of King's Chapel. As we come to a close, I would encourage you to reflect on their work and what kind of topics came up that remain relevant in classrooms today. And as we move into the conversation portion, and also continue to reflect on the theme of back to school this time of year.